ballroom looked like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, glowing softly and spreading warm light across the room. Round tables were covered in white cloth and decorated with fresh flowers. Glasses sparkled. Gentle laughter floated through the air. A small group of musicians had already finished their welcome piece, and now quiet background music played from hidden speakers. Near the far wall of the hall stood a grand piano. It was glossy black, perfectly polished, almost like a mirror. The lid was slightly open, as if waiting. A small sign rested on top of it. It politely said the piano was reserved for the evening's professional performer. Most guests walked past it without giving it much attention. They were busy greeting each other, taking photos, and discussing business deals. But one person noticed it right away. She was standing near the entrance earlier, helping her employer arrange some documents. Her dress was neat but simple, nothing like the expensive gowns around her. She blended into the background easily. Many people assumed she was part of the staff. She didn't correct them. When her tasks were done, she finally allowed herself a quiet moment. That was when her eyes found the piano. There was something about it that pulled her in. Maybe it was the shine of the keys under the soft lights. Maybe it was the memory it stirred inside her. She didn't even realize she had started walking toward it. She stopped a few steps away, just looking. Her reflection stared back at her from the black surface. For a second, the busy hall disappeared. The laughter faded. The music from the speakers felt distant. Without thinking too much, she lifted her hand and gently ran her fingers across the edge of the piano. She didn't press any keys. She only touched the smooth surface, almost like greeting an old friend. A voice suddenly broke the moment. "Please don't touch that." She turned quickly. A woman in a bright evening gown stood a few feet away, holding a glass in her hand. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were firm. "It's very expensive," the woman added. "The performer will be here soon." Before she could respond, another guest joined in. "Yes, it's better not to play around with it. These instruments are delicate." There was no anger in their tone, but there was something else. Doubt. Assumption. She quickly pulled her hand back. "I'm sorry," she said softly. The two guests nodded, satisfied, and walked away. They continued their conversation as if nothing had happened. She stayed where she was for a moment. Her cheeks felt warm. She hadn't even pressed a single key. She hadn't planned to, but somehow the warning felt heavier than it should have. She stepped back from the piano and moved toward a quieter corner of the hall. From there, she could still see it. As she watched, a few other guests passed by it. Some of them casually placed their purses on top of it while adjusting their shawls. One man even leaned against it while laughing loudly at a joke. No one stopped them. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, calm. But inside her chest, something felt tight. The truth was simple. She knew how to play. Not just simple tunes. Not just beginner pieces. Music had once been the most important part of her life. When she was a child, her home had been small and always a little noisy. Outside, traffic never really stopped. Inside, there was always something to fix or clean. But in the corner of the living room stood an old upright piano. It had scratches on its sides and one key that stuck sometimes. Still, to her, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Her father had found it in a second-hand shop. It had taken him months to save enough money. He brought it home one evening with the help of two neighbors. She still remembered how proud he looked. From that day on, she practiced every afternoon. At first, her fingers were clumsy. She made mistakes. She repeated the same parts again and again. But she never got tired of it. Music became her quiet place. When school felt hard, she played. When she felt lonely, she played. When she was happy, she played even more. Over the years, her skill grew. Teachers praised her. Neighbors would sometimes stand outside their window just to listen. She dreamed of playing on big stages one day. But life does not always follow dreams. When her father became ill, everything changed. Hospital visits replaced music lessons. Bills replaced sheet music. After he passed away, the house felt empty in a way that sound could not fix. Eventually, the piano had to be sold. She remembered the day strangers carried it away. She had stood silently by the door, pressing her lips together so she wouldn't cry. Felt like losing him all over again. After that, she focused on work. She did what she had to do. There was no time for music schools or competitions. Dreams were quietly folded and placed somewhere deep inside her. Years passed. She never stopped loving the piano. Whenever she passed one in a hotel or a mall, she would slow down. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine the weight of the keys under her fingers. But she rarely allowed herself to sit and play. Not because she couldn't, because she felt it no longer belonged to her world. Back in the ballroom, laughter grew louder as more guests arrived. A server passed by her with a tray of drinks. She politely shook her head. Her employer waved at her from across the room, signaling that everything was under control for now. She nodded. The piano still stood there, quiet and untouched. A small group gathered near it again. This time, someone joked, "I hope the performer is better than the last one we hired for an event." Another replied, "Oh, they're bringing someone well-known tonight. We're in good hands." She listened without meaning to. There was excitement in their voices. Expectation. One of them glanced at her briefly. "You play?" he asked casually, almost as a joke. She hesitated. "A little," she answered honestly. He laughed lightly. "Well, better leave it to the professionals tonight." The others smiled. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it carried the same quiet assumption as before. She gave a small nod. Of course. Inside, something whispered that she should walk away from that corner completely, that she should focus only on her responsibilities and forget about the piano. But her eyes kept drifting back to it. The lights above reflected off its surface. It looked patient, waiting. She wondered who the hired performer was. She wondered what piece would open the evening. Something classical, perhaps. Something dramatic to impress the crowd. She imagined how the first note would echo in the hall. How conversations would slowly fade. Her fingers twitched slightly at the thought. She folded her hands together to keep them still. Another guest approached the piano and read the small sign on top. "Reserved," he read aloud. "Strictly no unauthorized playing." He laughed and shook his head. "Good idea. You never know who might try." The group around him nodded. She felt the words settle heavily in her chest. Unauthorized. The music playing softly from the speakers changed to a slower tune. The atmosphere felt calmer now. More guests were seated at their tables. An announcement came through the microphone. The host welcomed everyone warmly and mentioned that the live piano performance would begin shortly. There was applause. She felt her heart beat a little faster, though she wasn't sure why. She had no role in the performance. She was just another face in the room. Still, she couldn't ignore the strange mix of excitement and sadness rising inside her. She took a deep breath and allowed herself one last look at the piano. In her mind, she saw not the grand instrument in the ballroom, but the old upright piano from her childhood home. She could almost hear the uneven key. She could almost feel her father standing nearby, listening quietly. For a brief second, she imagined sitting at the grand piano now. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to let the music speak the way it used to. But the memory of the earlier warning echoed in her ears. "Please don't touch that. It's very expensive. Better leave it to the professionals." She straightened her shoulders. Maybe they were right. Maybe this wasn't her place anymore. She turned slightly away from the piano and prepared to move back toward her employer's table. The evening would continue as planned. The professional would arrive. The music would fill the room. And she would remain in the background, just as everyone expected. Still, as she took her first step away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the story of that piano and her own story were somehow about to cross paths again. For now, the instrument stood silent, and so did she. When she stepped away from the piano that evening, the noise of the ballroom slowly returned to normal around her. People were laughing again. Glasses touched with soft clinks. The host moved from table to table with a confident smile. Everything looked perfect on the outside. But inside her, something had been stirred awake. She tried to focus on small tasks. She checked her phone for messages from her employer. She adjusted the stack of papers in her bag. She even walked toward the refreshment table and picked up a glass of water just to keep her hands busy. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back. The simple warning, "Please don't touch that," should not have meant so much. It was just a sentence. It wasn't even rude. But it pressed against old memories she had carefully kept hidden for years. She found a quiet chair near the back of the hall and sat down for a moment. From there, she could see almost the entire room. The piano stood at the front like a centerpiece. People admired it from a distance, but no one dared to sit at it. She remembered a time when she didn't need permission to play. When she was very young, her world had been much smaller than this ballroom. Their home had only 2 bedrooms and a narrow kitchen. The paint on the walls had begun to fade. During summer, the fan in the living room made a slight shaking sound when it turned. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was the old piano standing in the corner. It had not looked impressive. The wood had tiny cracks. Some keys were slightly yellow from age. One pedal made a soft squeak when pressed. But when she sat in front of it, the entire room felt different. Her father used to sit on the sofa with a cup of tea and close his eyes while she practiced. He never rushed her. He never told her to lower the volume, even when she repeated the same difficult part again and again. He would simply say, "Play it again. This time, feel it." At first, she did not understand what he meant by feel it. She thought music was about hitting the right keys at the right time. But slowly she began to understand. It was about emotion, about telling a story without words. She didn't have expensive lessons at the beginning. A neighbor taught her the basics. Later, a kind teacher at school noticed her talent and offered free guidance after classes. She practiced every day. Sometimes her fingers hurt. Sometimes she made mistakes that made her want to cry. But she never thought about quitting. Music was not a hobby to her. It was a part of her. In school programs, she would sit on stage in a simple dress and play while parents recorded videos on their phones. She never felt nervous. The moment her fingers touched the keys, she felt calm, safe. There was one particular performance she remembered clearly. It was during a small community event. The stage lights were too bright, and the microphone near the piano made a soft, buzzing sound. But when she began playing, the crowd became quiet in a way she had never experienced before. After she finished, there was a pause. Then applause filled the room. She saw pride in her father's eyes that night. It was the kind of pride that stays with a person forever. Back in the present, sitting in the ballroom, she closed her eyes for a second. The applause from that childhood memory felt stronger than any sound around her now. Life, however, had not stayed simple. Her father's illness had come slowly at first. It started with small signs: tiredness, long silences, missed days at work. Then hospital visits became regular. Medicine costs began to grow. The atmosphere at home changed from hopeful to worried. During those months, she practiced less. Not because she wanted to, but because time felt different. She spent more evenings in hospital waiting rooms than in front of the piano. Sometimes, after returning home late at night, she would sit quietly at the piano and play very softly so she wouldn't wake anyone. The music sounded different then. More heavy, more emotional. After he passed away, the house felt too quiet. For weeks, she couldn't bring herself to touch the piano at all. It stood there like a memory she wasn't ready to face. When she finally sat down again, the first note made her cry. The financial pressure grew quickly after that. Bills had to be paid. Food had to be bought. Dreams felt like something expensive and far away. Selling the piano was not an easy decision. She tried to hold on to it as long as possible. But one afternoon, she overheard her mother talking about unpaid expenses. That night, she made the choice. The day it was taken away felt like the closing of a chapter. The empty space in the corner of the living room looked larger than it should have. She avoided looking at it for days. After finishing school, she started working immediately. First, small jobs. Then a more stable position assisting someone who organized corporate events. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She became responsible, reliable, quiet. Whenever she attended events in large hotels, she often saw grand pianos placed near stages or dance floors. Sometimes they were played beautifully. Other times they were simply decorative pieces. Each time she passed one, a small part of her heart reacted. But she trained herself not to show it. People around her did not know about her past with music. She rarely mentioned it. When someone once asked about her hobbies, she simply said she liked listening to songs. Felt easier that way. Years passed like that, until this evening. The warning near the piano had reopened something she thought she had locked away. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands again. They did not look different from anyone else's hands in the room, but she knew what they were capable of. Across the hall, she noticed a young child standing near the piano with curiosity. The child reached toward the keys, but a parent quickly pulled the hand back and whispered something about not touching. The scene felt familiar. She wondered how many times talent stays hidden because of small warnings, because of quiet assumptions. The professional pianist still had not arrived. She overheard two organizers speaking in low voices about a delay due to traffic. The host tried to remain calm, but there was tension in his expression. Guests were beginning to glance toward the stage area more often. She felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her hoped the pianist would arrive soon so the evening could continue smoothly. Another part of her, one she did not fully understand, felt something else. Not hope, not fear, something in between. She stood up from her chair and slowly walked closer to the stage area again. Not too close, just enough to see the piano clearly. Under the lights, it looked even more beautiful now. She imagined placing her fingers on the keys again. Not just touching the surface this time, actually playing. Would the notes still come easily? Would her hands remember what her heart never forgot? She took a slow breath. A memory surfaced, her father's voice saying, "Play it again. This time, feel it." She realized something important in that moment. Even if the world had moved on, even if life had forced her in a different direction, the music inside her had never truly disappeared. It had only been waiting, waiting for courage, waiting for a moment. In the ballroom, the chatter grew slightly louder as the delay continued. The host checked his watch. The microphone stood ready. The piano remained silent. She stood there quietly, her heart beating in a steady rhythm. She did not know yet that the night was about to change. She did not know that the same people who had warned her earlier would soon listen differently. For now, she simply stood between her past and her present, feeling the weight of both. The girl who once played without fear still lived inside her. And somewhere deep down, that girl was ready to be heard again. The delay that first felt small slowly became noticeable to everyone in the hall. At the beginning, guests were patient. They continued their conversations, enjoyed their drinks, and smiled for photos. But as minutes passed, people began checking their watches. Some leaned closer to each other and whispered. The host stood near the stage, holding his phone tightly. His confident smile had started to fade. He stepped aside to make a call, speaking in a low voice. From where she stood, she could not hear every word, but she understood enough. Traffic. Stuck. At least another 40 minutes. 40 minutes felt like a very long time in a room full of important guests expecting live music. The host ended the call and took a deep breath before walking back toward the microphone. He adjusted it and forced a cheerful tone. He thanked everyone again for attending and said the pianist was on the way. He asked for a little more patience. Polite applause followed, but it was softer than before. She stood near one of the pillars, watching everything carefully. She had attended many events like this before. She knew how quickly a small delay could change the mood of a room. Music was not just entertainment tonight. It was part of the experience. Without it, the evening felt incomplete. A few guests moved closer to the stage area, almost as if staring at the piano would make the performer appear faster. One of the organizers walked up to the host and whispered something urgently. The host nodded, but worry was clear on his face now. She felt her heartbeat quicken without knowing why. Then, unexpectedly, the host's eyes scanned the room and landed on her. He paused for a second, as if remembering something. Then he walked toward her. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had done something wrong. Maybe there was another task she had forgotten. Maybe her employer needed something. He stopped in front of her with a polite but tense smile. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Earlier someone mentioned you might know how to play. Is that true?" The question caught her off guard. It was the same light comment from before, but now it sounded different. More serious. She hesitated. Her mind moved quickly. She could easily say no. It would be simpler, safer. "I used to play," she answered carefully. The host looked at the stage, then back at her. "Would you be able to play something simple? Just to fill the time until our performer arrives." Her chest felt tight. Around them, a few nearby guests had noticed the conversation. The woman who had warned her earlier about touching the piano was standing not far away. She raised her eyebrows slightly. Another guest gave a small, doubtful smile. It was not open mockery. It was something quieter. The kind of look that says, "This should be interesting." She swallowed. Inside her mind, memories rushed back. The small living room, the old upright piano, her father's voice telling her to feel the music, the applause at community events. But those memories were years old. What if her hands had forgotten? What if nerves made her stumble? What if the people in this elegant hall expected perfection she could not deliver? "I don't want to cause any problem," she said softly. "You won't," the host replied quickly. "Just something light. Anything. It's better than silence." Silence. She glanced toward the piano. Still stood there, untouched, waiting. A part of her wanted to step back and refuse. To stay in the safe corner of the room where expectations were low. But another part of her, the one that had been waking up all evening, whispered that this might be the moment she had been unknowingly waiting for. She looked back at the host. His expression was hopeful now, almost pleading. He was not judging her. He simply needed help. She nodded slowly. "I can try," she said. The host's shoulders relaxed immediately. "Thank you," he replied with real relief. "That's all we need." As he walked toward the microphone again, she felt her palms grow slightly warm. She wiped them gently against the sides of her dress. The host tapped the microphone, drawing attention once more. "While we wait for our special guest performer," he announced with a bright tone, "we are fortunate to have someone here who has kindly agreed to share a few pieces with us." There was a soft murmur across the room. She became very aware of every step as she began walking toward the stage area. The distance felt longer than before. The lights seemed brighter. She could feel eyes following her. Not everyone looked impressed. Some looked curious. A few looked amused. One or two simply returned to their conversations, not expecting much. The woman who had warned her earlier folded her arms gently. Her expression was polite but doubtful. She reached the piano and stopped for a second. Up close, it looked even more powerful. The black surface reflected the chandelier lights above. The keys were perfectly aligned, clean, untouched. She placed her hand on the bench and slowly sat down. The room was not completely silent, but it had grown quieter. Conversations had lowered to whispers. She adjusted the distance between herself and the keys. It had been years since she had sat at a grand piano like this. The shape felt different from the upright she once had at home. Her fingers hovered above the keys without touching them. For a brief second, fear tried to take control. What if the first note sounds wrong? What if they were right to doubt? She closed her eyes. In that moment, the ballroom disappeared again. The expensive dresses, the polished shoes, the bright lights. All of it faded. She saw instead the small living room from her childhood. She saw the old piano with its uneven key. She heard her father's calm voice. "Play it again. This time, feel it." She took a slow breath. Her fingers lowered gently onto the keys. The first note came out soft, clear, steady. A few people near the back continued whispering, but others turned their heads toward the stage. She played a simple melody at first. Something calm, familiar, not flashy. Her hands moved carefully, as if remembering the shape of each key. The sound filled the hall slowly, like warm light spreading across a dark room. Conversations began to fade. She moved into the next phrase with more confidence. Her fingers grew steadier. The rhythm settled naturally. The piano responded beautifully under her touch. The soft background noise disappeared almost completely now. She did not look up at the audience. She focused only on the music, on the rise and fall of each note, on the feeling behind it. The melody grew richer, stronger. She allowed emotion to guide her hands. Not fear, not doubt. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, she forgot that she was in a formal ballroom. She forgot about the warnings, the raised eyebrows, the quiet assumptions. There was only the music. A man near the front slowly lowered his glass onto the table without breaking eye contact with the stage. The woman who had warned her earlier shifted her posture, her expression changing from doubt to surprise. The host stood near the side, watching closely. The tension on his face slowly melted into amazement. Her fingers moved with growing confidence now. Years may have passed, but the skill had not left her. It had only been waiting for permission to return. The melody rose higher, filled with emotion that felt both gentle and powerful. The sound echoed beautifully against the walls of the hall. Every note carried a piece of her story. The joy of childhood, the pain of loss, the years of silence, the quiet strength she had built. The room was completely silent now except for the piano. She pressed the final sequence of notes with control and grace. Then the last note rang out, hanging in the air like a question. For a moment no one moved. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not awkward. It was not impatient. It was stunned. Her hands slowly lifted from the keys. She opened her eyes. Dozens of faces stared back at her. Not with doubt. Not with amusement. With surprise. With respect. The same piano that people had warned her not to touch had just spoken in a way no one expected. And the evening had changed in a way no one saw coming. For a few long seconds after the final note faded, the hall remained completely still. It was the kind of silence that felt full, not empty. No glasses clinked. No chairs moved. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed quieter. She kept her hands resting lightly above the keys, unsure if she should stand up or continue. Her heart was beating fast, but her face remained calm. Inside, she felt like the younger version of herself again, the girl who once waited for applause at small community events. Then it happened. One person near the front slowly began clapping. The sound was soft at first, almost careful, as if testing whether others felt the same way. But within seconds, more hands joined in. The applause grew stronger, louder, filling the entire ballroom. People who had been whispering earlier were now fully turned toward the stage. Some were smiling in disbelief. A few even stood up from their chairs. The woman who had warned her not to touch the piano was clapping too. Her expression had completely changed. There was no doubt in her eyes now, only surprise and something close to admiration. She stood slowly from the bench and gave a small, respectful nod. She did not try to look proud or dramatic. She simply looked grateful. The host stepped closer to the stage, clapping harder than anyone else. When the applause began to settle, he leaned toward her slightly and whispered, "That was beautiful. Truly." She gave a quiet thank you. But before she could step away from the piano, a voice from the audience called out, "One more!" A few others agreed. "Yes, please," someone said from the back. She froze for a second. She had only planned to fill a few minutes. Just something simple. She had not expected this reaction. The host looked at her questioningly. "Would you like to?" he asked gently, making sure she did not feel pressured. She glanced at the audience again. This time their faces were different. They were not watching to judge. They were watching because they wanted to listen. She slowly sat back down. The applause returned briefly, softer now, full of anticipation. She placed her fingers on the keys again, but this time there was less fear. Her breathing steadied. The nervous weight in her chest had lifted slightly. Instead of choosing something simple, she decided to play a piece that had once meant a lot to her. It was not the most complicated composition in the world, but it carried deep emotion. She had played it many times during her teenage years, especially on evenings when she needed comfort. The first notes came out gently, almost like a whisper. The room responded instantly. Conversations stopped completely this time. Even the servers paused near the walls, listening quietly. As the melody unfolded, it felt warmer than before. She allowed herself to fully connect with each phrase. Her hands moved naturally, no longer cautious. The piano responded with richness and depth. The sound filled the hall in a way that felt almost personal. It did not feel like background music anymore. It felt like a story being told. A man near the center table leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as he listened. A woman at another table pressed her hand gently against her chest, moved by something she could not explain. The host stood still, watching her with a new kind of respect. As she reached the middle of the piece, the music grew stronger. The notes rose higher, building emotion. She pressed the keys with confidence, letting the sound expand fully into the space. Years of silence seemed to disappear in that moment. All the time she had spent away from a piano, all the doubt she had quietly carried, it felt like it was dissolving with every note. She was not thinking about impressing anyone now. She was simply playing. Her fingers moved quickly across the keys during a short, flowing passage. The sound danced through the room, bright and alive. A few guests exchanged wide-eyed looks, clearly not expecting this level of skill. The woman who had warned her earlier now sat with her hands folded together, completely focused. There was no hint of judgment left, only attention. As the melody softened again, she allowed the final section to slow down naturally. The music became gentle, reflective, almost like a quiet goodbye. When the last note faded, the silence returned. But this time it lasted even longer. No one rushed to clap. No one spoke. It was as if the entire hall needed a moment to breathe. Then the applause exploded. It was louder than before, stronger, more sincere. Several guests stood up, not because they felt they had to, but because they genuinely wanted to. She felt her throat tighten slightly, not from fear, from emotion. She stood once again, this time with a small smile she could not hide. She bowed her head gently. The host walked onto the stage area beside her and spoke into the microphone. His voice carried clear admiration. "Well," he said, "I believe we have been given an unexpected gift tonight." The audience laughed softly and continued clapping. He turned to her. "You didn't just fill time. You transformed the room." She shook her head lightly, almost shy. "I only played," she said quietly. But everyone knew it had been more than that. As she stepped away from the piano, several guests moved closer to the stage. They wanted to speak to her, to compliment her, to ask where she had trained. One older gentleman approached first. "How long have you been performing professionally?" he asked. She paused. "I don't perform professionally," she answered honestly. He looked genuinely shocked. "That's impossible," he said with a smile. "You play like someone who has been on stages for years." She simply thanked him. The woman in the bright evening gown, the same one who had stopped her earlier, slowly walked forward as well. For a brief moment they made eye contact. "I owe you an apology," the woman said quietly. "I shouldn't have assumed." Her voice was sincere. There was no pride left in it. She offered a gentle smile. "It's all right," she replied, and she truly meant it. Because in that moment, there was no anger in her heart, only relief. Across the hall, someone whispered, "Who is she?" And another answered, "I have no idea, but she's incredible." The hired professional pianist finally arrived a few minutes later, slightly out of breath and apologetic. But instead of disappointment, he walked into a room buzzing with excitement. The host greeted him warmly and explained what had happened. The performer looked toward her with curiosity and respect. "I heard the applause from outside," he said with a friendly smile. "That must have been you." She felt her cheeks warm again. The professional later took his place at the piano to continue the program as planned. He was talented, experienced, polished. But something had shifted in the room already. People listened differently now. and she stood among them, no longer invisible. For the first time in many years, she did not feel like someone standing on the outside of the music. She felt like she belonged to it again. As the evening continued, conversations changed. Guests spoke not only about business or formal topics, but about the unexpected performance, about the emotion they felt, about how surprising talent can be. She quietly stepped back toward her original place near the pillar, but the view felt different now. Earlier, she had stood there feeling small. Now, she stood there knowing something important. The piano had not rejected her. It had remembered her, and so had she. The energy in the ballroom did not go back to the way it had been before. Even after the professional pianist began his performance, there was a different feeling in the air. People were still listening to the music, but every now and then, their eyes drifted toward her. She tried to return to her usual role. She checked on her employer, made sure everything was running smoothly, and answered a few small questions from guests. But something had changed inside her. She felt lighter, as if a door that had been locked for years had quietly opened. During a short break in the program, several guests approached her again. This time, their questions were more thoughtful. "Where did you study?" one woman asked gently. "Do you perform often?" another man added. She smiled politely and answered honestly, "I haven't performed in years." The responses surprised them. They expected a long list of awards or famous teachers. Instead, they heard a simple story about learning at home, practicing after school, and stepping away from music because life demanded other responsibilities. One guest shook his head slowly. "That makes it even more impressive," he said. "You play with feeling. That cannot be taught easily." His words stayed with her. The woman who had warned her earlier returned once more, this time without hesitation. She stood close enough that they did not need to raise their voices. "I judged too quickly," the woman said quietly. "I saw your clothes and assumed you were part of the event staff who had just wandered too close to the piano." There was no pride left in her tone, only honesty. She nodded softly. "It's okay," she replied. "It happens." "But it shouldn't," the woman added. "I forgot that talent doesn't come with a dress code." They both smiled at that. Across the hall, she noticed a small group of younger guests speaking excitedly. One of them glanced at her and gave a small thumbs up. She almost laughed. The moment felt simple and human. The host eventually walked toward her again, holding a small card in his hand. "I need to say something," he began. "Tonight could have gone very differently. You saved us from an awkward situation." "I only filled time," she said again. "No," he corrected gently. "You gave everyone something they did not expect. That's rare." He handed her the card. "This belongs to a friend of mine. He organizes cultural programs and charity concerts. I told him about your performance. He would like to speak with you." She looked down at the card, unsure how to react. For years, music had felt like something from her past. Now it was standing in front of her again, asking questions. "I'm not sure," she began. "You don't have to decide anything now," the host said kindly. "Just keep it. Opportunities don't always knock loudly. Sometimes they whisper." She folded the card carefully and placed it inside her small bag. Later in the evening, dinner was served. Guests returned to their tables, but the conversations were warmer now. The professional pianist continued to play beautifully in the background, yet many still mentioned her unexpected performance. At one table, she overheard someone say, "That was the highlight of the night." At another, a guest commented, "It reminded me why live music matters." She sat quietly at a side table for a moment, letting the words settle in her heart. For so long, she had told herself that her time with music was over, that it belonged to childhood memories and nothing more. But tonight had shown her something different. It had shown her that the music inside her had not faded. It had simply waited. As the evening began to wind down, guests slowly prepared to leave. Coats were collected. Final handshakes were exchanged. The chandeliers still shone brightly, but the energy was softer now. She walked once more toward the piano. The professional performer had finished his set and stepped away to pack his sheet music. The instrument stood alone again. This time, no one stopped her as she approached it. She did not sit down. She simply placed her hand gently on its polished surface. The same piano that had almost remained silent because of a simple warning. Behind her, the woman in the bright gown passed by and paused briefly. "You should never let anyone tell you not to play," she said quietly before walking away. Those words felt different from the earlier warning. They felt like a lesson learned. As the final guests exited the hall, the host came over to thank her once more. "We'll be in touch," he said sincerely. She nodded, unsure what the future would hold. When she finally stepped outside the hotel, the night air felt cool and fresh. The city lights stretched around her, and traffic hummed in the distance. She stood still for a moment on the sidewalk. The evening replayed in her mind. The warning, the hesitation, the first note, the silence after the final chord. That silence had said more than applause ever could. It was not just surprise. It was realization. People had realized they were wrong to judge so quickly. But more importantly, she had realized something about herself. She had spent years believing she no longer belonged on a stage. That music was something she once had, not something she still carried. Tonight proved otherwise. As she began walking toward the bus stop, she reached into her bag and touched the small card the host had given her. She did not pull it out. She only felt its edges between her fingers. For the first time in a long while, the future did not feel limited. It felt open. At home later that night, she could not sleep immediately. The applause still echoed softly in her mind. Not in a loud way, but like a distant memory that refused to fade. She sat by her window, looking at the quiet street below. She thought about her father. She imagined what he would have said if he had been in that ballroom. She could almost hear his voice again. Play it again. This time, feel it. A small smile appeared on her face. The silence that followed her final note earlier had once felt heavy. Now it felt powerful. It was the silence of people who had been proven wrong in the best possible way. It was the silence of respect. And deep inside, she knew something had shifted permanently. The world had told her not to play. But when she did, the sound left them silent. And this time, she was not going to let that silence fade into the background of her life again. The morning after the event felt different from any other morning she had lived in years. Sunlight came through her window the same way it always did. The street outside sounded the same. Vendors called out. Buses passed. Life had not changed overnight. But inside her, something had shifted. She woke up earlier than usual, not because she had to, but because her mind would not stay still. The memory of the ballroom returned the moment she opened her eyes. The piano, the silence, the applause. For a second, she wondered if she had imagined it. Then she reached for her bag hanging on the chair beside her bed. She opened it and carefully pulled out the small card the host had given her. The name printed on it belonged to someone who organized cultural programs, charity concerts, and small music festivals. Beneath the name was a phone number and an email address. She stared at it for a long moment. In the past, she might have placed the card inside a drawer and forgotten about it. She might have told herself that the evening had been a lucky moment, nothing more. But now she felt different. Not proud, not overconfident, just aware. Aware that she had been given a second chance to look at something she once loved. She got ready for work as usual. She chose a simple outfit, tied her hair back neatly, and stepped outside. On the bus ride, she kept replaying the faces from the ballroom. The surprise, the respect, the change in expression from doubt to admiration. It wasn't the applause that stayed with her the most. It was the silence before it. That stillness had felt powerful. It had felt like the world pausing to admit it had been wrong. When she reached the office, her employer greeted her warmly. "I've been hearing about you all morning," he said with a wide smile. She looked confused. "About me?" "The host called," he explained. "He couldn't stop talking about your performance. You kept that event from falling apart." She felt her cheeks warm again. "I only played for a few minutes." He shook his head gently. Sometimes a few minutes are enough. Throughout the day, she completed her tasks as usual, but her thoughts kept returning to the card in her bag. Around lunchtime, she finally made a decision. She stepped outside into a quiet corner near the building. Her hands felt slightly nervous as she took out her phone. She looked at the number on the card and took a deep breath. Then she dialed. The phone rang twice before someone answered. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. She introduced herself politely and mentioned the event from the previous evening. There was a brief pause. Then the tone on the other side changed. "Yes, I heard about you," the voice said warmly. "I was told your performance moved the entire room." Her heart beat faster. They spoke for several minutes. He asked about her background, her training, and whether she was currently performing anywhere. She answered honestly. She explained that she had stepped away from music years ago due to personal responsibilities. There was no judgment in his voice. "I'm organizing a small charity concert next month," he said. "Nothing too large, just a meaningful event for a good cause. Would you consider playing one piece?" She felt a mix of excitement and fear. "One piece?" she repeated softly. "Yes, no pressure, just something from the heart." She looked up at the sky for a moment. In that instant, she realized that this was not about fame or recognition. It was about reconnecting with a part of herself she had almost forgotten. "I would like that," she said finally. After the call ended, she stood still for a moment, letting the decision settle inside her. That evening, instead of going straight home, she stopped by a small music shop she had passed many times before but never entered. Inside, the smell of polished wood and paper filled the air. A few instruments were displayed along the walls. In one corner stood a digital piano. She walked toward it slowly. The shop owner looked up from behind the counter. "Would you like to try it?" he asked kindly. She nodded. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a second, just like they had in the ballroom. But this time there were no judging eyes. No whispers. She pressed a single key. The sound was clear, simple, honest. She began to play softly, testing the feel of the instrument. The notes came easily. Not perfectly, but naturally. The shop owner stood quietly, listening with a small smile. "You've played before," he said after she finished. "Yes," she replied. "A long time ago." He nodded. "It shows." Over the next few weeks, she visited the shop often. Sometimes she practiced there for an hour after work. Sometimes longer. The charity concert approached slowly, but instead of feeling fear, she felt something she had not felt in years. Excitement. On the day of the concert, the venue was smaller than the Grand Hotel ballroom. The audience was modest. Families, friends, community members. She stood backstage, waiting for her turn. Her hands felt slightly cold, but her heart felt steady. When her name was announced, she walked onto the stage calmly. The lights were not as bright as before. The setting was simple, but it felt real. She sat at the piano and looked out at the audience. Some faces were curious. Some were smiling. She thought of the ballroom, the warning, the silence. Then she thought of her father. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. This time, she did not play to prove anyone wrong. She played because she wanted to. The music flowed smoothly. The notes carried emotion, warmth, and honesty. She allowed herself to enjoy every second. When she finished, the applause felt sincere and gentle. But what mattered most was how she felt inside. She felt whole. After the concert, several people approached her with kind words. A young girl shyly told her she wanted to learn piano one day. She bent down slightly and encouraged her warmly. That moment meant more to her than any large stage ever could. In the months that followed, she did not quit her job or change her life overnight. She continued working, continued being responsible. But she also continued playing. She performed at small events, community programs, and charity gatherings. Word spread slowly, not in a dramatic way, just naturally. And each time she sat at a piano, she remembered that first warning in the ballroom. They had said not to play. They had assumed she did not belong there. But when she chose to sit down and press those keys, The sound had changed everything. It had not only left them silent, it had awakened her. Years later, whenever she saw someone hesitate near a piano or any instrument, she would gently say something different from what she once heard. "Go ahead," she would tell them with a smile. "Play," because she had learned something important. Talent does not disappear because life becomes difficult. Dreams do not die because they are paused. And sometimes all it takes is one brave moment, one decision to ignore a warning, to remind the world and yourself of who you truly are. The piano in that ballroom had once stood silent, guarded by assumptions. But the night she chose to play, the sound spoke louder than any doubt ever could. And from that day forward, she never again allowed silence to decide her story.